Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. Today, we're going to discuss the leadership of Admiral William Bull Halsey Jr. and his command in the Pacific during World War II. Well, good morning, General. Welcome back.
It's good to be back, Tad.
So today, as we mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about Admiral Halsey and his evolution of leadership throughout his time in the Pacific during World War II. To tee it up, at the beginning of the war, he's on the Enterprise, and they're out in the ocean during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, comes back and they start assessing the situation, and he prepares a campaign plan for the Central Pacific.
Admiral Halsey is one of the great leaders in the history of the U.S. Navy, one of the five-star admirals that was made at the end of the Second World War. So he had a profound effect on what happened to the U.S. Navy in the Second World War. But I think a close examination of the way he developed over the period of the Second World War is illustrative when you talk about how senior leaders interact with technology, how they adapt or fail to adapt to the inevitable changes that occur in a lengthy military campaign, naval campaign in this case.
Right. So, because starting in 1941, obviously, he starts planning the campaign for aggressively for using aircraft off of aircraft carriers to start doing raids and bombing scenarios that kind of start striking back against the Japanese, including famously the Doolittle raid in that time. But during that time and period, what's his leadership look like, and how's he developing as a leader, as a admiral during that first period?
So really, in the first period of the war, and in fact to the very end of the war, the thing that would distinguish Halsey was aggressiveness. He was an aggressive commander. He sought to attack. He sought opportunities to attack. And that's a great quality in a commander. And I don't mean to diminish it. It's a very important quality in a commander. But when you talk about how you're going to attack, you need to understand the limits and the capabilities of the weapon systems that you have. In 1942, he was an extremely aggressive, capable commander. Although he missed Midway because of a skin condition that required him to remain at Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Spruance and Admiral Fletcher actually fought the Battle of Midway. An intriguing counterfactual would be to explore what would have happened had Halsey been at Midway. We'll never know the answer to that question. But we do know later in 1942 into 1943, when the Guadalcanal campaign bogged down, the Southwest Pacific campaign bogged down, Admiral Nimitz sent Halsey down there to light a fire under everybody. Relieved Admiral Gormley, who was a very good commander, but was just unable to actually bring it all together, the air, land, sea nature of the fight up and down the Solomons Islands that centered around possession of the really ugly, detestable, horrible little island of Guadalcanal that the United States Marine Corps invaded on 6 August 1942. And it became the centerpiece of that fight. Halsey was sent in as the fireman to breathe fire and aggressiveness into the force, and he did that. His idea was to continually pound the Japanese, to seek combat with them whenever possible, and he was very successful in doing that. Now, he had losses, but here's the thing. In 1942 and into 1943, if you're going to understand the weapon that you're confronting and the weapon that you have, carrier warfare is offensive in nature. The carrier had very limited ability to defend itself. Radar was still primitive. The combat information centers and warships were very nascent. And by combat information center, I mean the ability to bring all source information in on the ship, not on the bridge, but in a place where you could collate it, display it, and make actionable decisions. Very nascent during this period of time. So the aircraft carrier, which is a very fragile ship, easily bombed, easily sunk, was a platform that had to strike first to be offensive in its nature. It was very hard to defend those platforms. So Admiral Halsey understood this. He understood this and had some success employing those carriers under that concept. And that was really what I call the first phase of Admiral Halsey's career. First of all, a magnetic leader. He was very effective in leading the Navy to fight in those close waters in and around Guadalcanal, what we call the slot, that led to the Navy, a very ugly, bloody Navy campaign that we won. And we broke the Imperial Japanese Navy really for the first time in those campaigns in the dark waters around Guadalcanal. He was fundamental to that success.
Right, he infused a lot of energy, and again, that aggressiveness, which Gormley was criticized for not being aggressive enough, risking battle with the Navy, and that's where Halsey came up with the slogan, hit hard, hit fast, and hit often, which was kind of a big piece of his persona and that leadership that he carried going forward throughout the war.
You're absolutely right. He gained a lot of publicity for that, and which was needed back home. The American people needed to know they had admirals who could fight and who were successful. And he became the face of that in many ways. To Halsey's credit, I don't think he particularly sought that, but it just fastened on him. And he became a figure well known back in the United States as, perhaps our preeminent fighting admiral in that war.
Right, because even his persona going with that, his name was Bill Halsey, William Halsey, but a newspaper reporter actually put Bull Halsey in that report. And then he started being known as Bull Halsey, and that Bull, a moniker, if you will, stuck.
All of that contributed to his image.
Right.
And again, he didn't seek it, but it was useful. It was useful for the United States Navy and for, because of the war against Japan, we needed to give confidence to the home front that we had people out there that could fight and prevail against a very difficult opponent, the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Right, having that quality of tenacity and energy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's the first couple of years of the war with Halsey developing from obviously 1942, 1943. But as 1944 kicks on and the fleet is moving now away from the Southern Pacific, more towards Central Pacific and the Philippines, a couple scenarios Halsey meets with, and he meets some criticism, particularly in the Battle of Lagay Gulf.
That's correct.
Of the
so what happens technically to the instrument that he's commanding then is, first of all, a bunch of U.S. Essex-class carriers enter the fight. Probably 10 by the latter stages of the war. And these are the gold standard in aircraft carriers of the Second World War. In fact, many of these carriers served honorably into the 1960s in the United States, very capable platforms. So bigger carriers, better designed carriers, bigger air wings on those carriers. But more importantly, perhaps, the United States Navy underwent a renaissance in how to handle information in combat. I talked a little bit earlier about the Combat Information Center. Now, by second half of 1943, certainly by spring of 1944, this is now commonplace on U.S. Navy ships and on the carriers themselves. Right. Radars are also better. So now what you have is you have the ability to direct the defensive air battle to a degree that you did not possess in 1942. So now by 1944, a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, 2, 3, 4 carriers, however big it is not an offensive system that you have to use or lose because you're afraid of the Japanese counterattack. In fact, the carrier now can defend itself very effectively because of the increased ability to vector airplanes with radar, because of things like the fast battleships that began to enter the fight in 1943 in particular. The battleship was designed to fight other ships, but the battleships the U.S. Navy built and sent to the Pacific in the Second World War didn't do that much. Instead, they steamed around the carriers and provided vast anti-aircraft fires. More cruisers, more battleships, more destroyers, all gave a U.S. Carrier task force by the latter part of the war a remarkable ability to defend itself. And what was a truism, not a truism, but what was a bit of strategic guidance in the first part of the war, don't get into a fight with land-based aviation. Now, by 1944, and certainly by the latter part of 1944, carriers could stand in against land-based aviation and prevail. So my observation would be, I'm not sure that Admiral Halsey picked up on this change in technology effectively. He was still very aggressive, which is a good thing, but he had a platform, a capability that was far more nuanced in its ability to fight the Japanese, defend against the Japanese. And certainly by the latter part of 1944, not clear that he had absorbed those lessons. And so we actually have a comparison with Admiral Raymond Spruance, whom he shared command with, because the resources of the United States were so great that by really 1944, Admiral Halsey would run a couple of operations. He'd come home. Admiral Spruance would go out, just the commanders, take over the ships and run a couple of operations. I would argue that Admiral Spruance actually proved far more understanding of those changes that occurred in technology by the late stages of the Pacific War. Admiral Halsey perhaps did not.
Why does Halsey get more attention, particularly when there's a couple, disasters, if you will, or crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit towards the end of the war?
Well, because early in the war, he was the face of the U.S. Navy in the Second World War. And it's hard to take someone off a pedestal once they've been placed there. And so at the end of the war, he received 5 stars. Raymond Spruance did not. In retrospect, there's been a lot of discussion that, well, maybe Spruance was more deserving of one of those 5-star billets than Halsey. Spruance was approached by this, by the way, and he said, well, I wouldn't mind having a 5th star, but I wouldn't want it if it meant that Bill Halsey would not get a 5th star, which is very, I think, self-sacrificing of Spruance and sort of indicative of his quality and his character.
Sure, and the relationship the two admirals
and the
shared
close
as well,
relationship they had, and it was a very close relationship.
Because towards the end of the war, Halsey hits a couple bumps. So he's got this great career, aggressive, very popular, has his successes. But going back to the battle in the Philippines, ends up going on what's called Bull's Run, where he takes the Navy.
So the Battle of Leyte Gulf is not a lot of people know about it, but it is the largest naval battle ever fought, both in terms of area, in terms of ships engaged. And the core characteristic of it was the Japanese baited the United States to flow their carriers to the north, which then uncovered a channel through which the Japanese would be able to sortie their big battleship Yamato and go down and get, hopefully, into the invasion beachhead where we were offloading troops in the Philippines. So Admiral Halsey took the bait and he ran north because he wanted to fight a carrier battle. And perhaps because he was not present for the Midway battle, which is widely considered by everybody to be the decisive battle of the U.S. Navy in the Second World War. So he was predisposed to be aggressive. He was predisposed to go north. He went north, and he neglected to cover the strait through which, the San Bernardino Strait, through which the Japanese Navy then pushed their battleships. And so he's up north. Nobody's covering the strait. So the Japanese come through and they stumble on an American escort carrier group in a remarkably brave series of operations. The U.S. Navy turns them away through the self-sacrifice of a number of destroyers who launched attacks on battleships, by the fact that the task group commander was able to very aggressively and bravely maneuver his real small, defenseless carriers. The Japanese came down and they became confused and turned around and went back. And so the battle was saved because had they continued south, they probably could have gotten to the beachhead and probably could have inflicted grave damage on the offloading ships. Now, Halsey would have come back south by then, and the Japanese probably would have lost all their ships, but they would have inflicted a very grave defeat on the U.S. Navy. That was not available to them because A, the U.S. Navy fought bravely in the battle off San Bernardino, and B, because the Japanese commander didn't keep his objective in mind, became worried about the risk to his force and retreated back through San Bernardino Strait and actually prevented that battle from coming. But the fault is Halsey's. The fault for running north remains Bill Halsey's. And a lot of people have opined on this down through the years. It was an aggressive commander taking a risk, maybe a risk worth taking had he left something back to cover the strait through which the Japanese came. And he had the resources to do that. But I would argue by that stage of the war, he did not realize just how the war had changed, how vast his resources were. He could have left his battleships down there, his fast battleships, and they could have sealed that off. He chose not to do that. He sent them south, but late, and they arrived several hours after the Japanese had retrenched and moved back through the strait. That's just that for a lot of people is the classic example of an over-aggressive commander not using the instrument that he had to full capability. And we were sort of saved by the aggressiveness and capabilities of younger Navy commanders who actually fought the Japanese in a very unequal battle and then prevented them from taking advantage of what was a major mistake.
Because there's that same piece of information that Admiral Halsey jumped on to go north because he thought he had the main Japanese fleet there, so he wanted to chase them and destroy them. And then the Japanese commander had the same thought. They thought they engaged the main fleet within.
That's correct.
Within the Gulf.
Warfare is all unknowns. That's how commanders deal with that. I would argue that late in the war, Halsey was not as good as dealing with the unknowns as he was in the first part of the war. For one thing, he's been out there a long time.
Right, it's a long war.
It's a long war. You know, he certainly rotated back and forth with Spruance, but this was not his finest hour.
Sure, and then, but nonetheless, not a complete catastrophe. The U.S. still was able to conquer the Philippines and move north towards the Japanese.
Ultimately, a victory for the United States and a victory for the United States Navy. Could have been a more complete victory. It wasn't, but it was good enough for the fight that we were in.
But and Halsey obviously took some criticism for that, and after he retired, he did a number of talks and defending his actions.
Right.
Because it's hard to know what's going on the ground. Here many years later, or on the ship rather. But Afterwards, there's a couple other instances that hurts Halsey's reputation. This time, not the Japanese that are actually doing it.
No,
it's two cyclones.
Later, in the spring of 45, and into the summer of 45, there are two episodes involving his fleet where he ignores weather warnings, and that's significant, causes grave damage to the fleet, as much damage inflicted in those two cyclones as by any Japanese attack on that fleet. And you really have to lay, I think, the blame squarely at him for not listening to his technical people, not listening to his weather forecasters, and choosing to hold a course for the fleet that led to the loss of ships and the damage of other ships, including aircraft carriers. And that's another significant blow to the legacy of Admiral Halsey.
Right, because one of the cyclones, the first one, Cyclone Cobra, which they called Halsey Cyclone afterwards, but it actually destroyed a number of ships, like sank a number of destroyers and ended up losing a few hundred sailors. So
That's correct.
It was devastating. It was not
a significant event.
Right.
And the sea is not a forgiving environment. And you have to remember that you may be fighting your enemy on the ocean, but the ocean's also is going to take advantage of you if it gets the opportunity to do so.
But despite going through two of those tropical cyclones or typhoons in the Pacific and those withdrawals, his overall prestige was not hampered. He still maintained command, and still Nimitz did not relieve him or move him command. It was recommended that he do so.
There was a lot of sentiment to relieve him after those typhoons. Nimitz chose not to do that, again, because of the unique place he occupied in the American psyche by that period of time. He was the symbol of the U.S. Navy in that war. It's easy to be critical of that decision, but Nimitz was a smart guy, and he made the best decision he could to look for the larger war effort and the importance of keeping him in command.
Right. And the war ended up ending just a few months later without any major naval engagements after that peace. And Halsey was on the ship when they signed the surrender. That's correct. So now the war is over. Halsey goes on, gets his 5th star, and then ends up, retiring. What are some of the major lessons you think we can learn from that, from his leadership during the war?
So I think you, as a senior commander, you have to recognize that technology adapts continuously. You've got to be open to that, and some people are, some people aren't. He was not, I would argue, open to the changing nature of the fight, both in its essentials. The relationship between offense and defense changed over the course of the Pacific War at sea. Right. Second, he was not open to the new ways that the Navy had to bring information in and process it and present it to commanders. That's related to the first, but again, it's slightly different, and that's important. And I think those are, if I were going to draw a couple of lessons, that would be it. The third thing is you have to temper aggressiveness. Aggressive commander is a good thing. I would say I was probably an aggressive commander, but you have to balance it against the risk that's out there. And Nimitz's guidance at the Battle of Midway was calculated risk. Right. Don't bring your force into action unless you have the opportunity to inflict vastly asymmetric damage to the enemy. That happened at Midway. And that weighed heavily on Halsey that he was not there for that fight. And I think it affected him later in the war. Yeah, and the last point would be, Ted, you have to listen to your technical specialists. If the weatherman's telling you don't do it, you probably ought to listen to what your weather guessers are telling you, because particularly for a fleet at sea, the stakes are very high indeed.
Right, there's no safe ground there. And Halsey did say in a speech not long after the Battle of Midway that missing the Battle of Midway had been the greatest disappointment of his career. Do you think that might have played into why he was extra aggressive when he returned to the fleet, perhaps?
Ted, I think it was, particularly in Lady Gulf. Particularly in Lady Gulf.
And do you think that any other characteristics of the individuals at play? Is there a factor once you get that high in rank? Is there an issue with you're taking in so much information? It's just hard to adapt.
It is, and the danger is you get set in your ways. You kind of believe that you have the right answers, and it worked very effectively before. But what happened yesterday is no guidance for what's going to happen tomorrow on the battlefield, whether it's air, land, sea, or space.
So, what's your final thoughts on Admiral Halsey in your mind? Is he worth the continued study?
He's worth continued study. He's a great American leader. He's a brave sailor. He was the face of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific in the Second World War. But with all commanders, any commander anywhere, there are lessons to be learned. And there are lessons to be learned from his career, lessons that apply today in the U.S. Navy and other services as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, sir.
Tad, thanks for having me.
And that's going to wrap up another episode of What's Really Happening. We held an intriguing discussion on the evolution of leadership of Admiral Bull Halsey in the Pacific during World War II. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer here at the Global and National Security Institute. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to our next conversation when we find out what's really happening.